So we have some people asking if we can talk because they're not sure the sound is working. So I hope that everybody's receiving us. Great. So I think we can start now. Brett, I invite you to open the conference. Thank you.
Merci, Raida. Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everyone. Hopefully somebody nod if they can hear me okay. Yeah. Welcome to today's panel, co-organized by us at the Canada Centre and the Canadian Practitioners Network for the Prevention of Radicalization and Extremist Violence, entitled Successful and Less Successful Approaches to Primary and Secondary PVE Programs, a Systematic Review. Je m'appelle Brett Kubicek, tel que dit déjà. Je suis directeur principal par intérim pour le Centre canadien d'engagement communautaire et prévention de violence au sein du ministère de la Sécurité publique Canada. From the Canada Centre, I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which I and many of my other colleagues live and work is the unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, otherwise known as the City of Ottawa. Now, before I turn things over to my colleague Jihan Rabah, who will moderate and guide us through today's panel, I'd like to share a few words about the Canada Centre and highlight why today's topic is timely and important. Today, we're going to hear about research results on primary and secondary prevention efforts to counter violent radicalization, or counter-radicalization violence, as we often say, to add another term to the lexicon, or CRV, as we say in short. And we'll hear from researchers, but also practitioners. Over the last few years, especially since we started our work in 2017, the Government of Canada has begun to invest in these core pillars of prevention. That is, in addition to supporting prevention and intervention, we need to enhance the research capacity to better design and implement effective, evidence-based, and ethical approaches and policies to countering radicalization of violence. Investments in research, as we will hear today, are crucial to help professionalize the field and expand our collective capacity for countering radicalization of violence. Research is indicating that there are preventive approaches showing promising effects, but also where there's some ongoing gaps. Research is also helping show where some approaches are counterproductive and can be potentially harmful towards communities and therefore must be reconsidered. That's why we at the Canada Centre aim to take a multi-sector, interdisciplinary, evidence-based and non-securitized approach to countering radicalization of violence, informed by fields such as crime prevention, public health, community safety and well-being, and social work. Through the Community Resilience Fund, our Department of Public Safety provides funding in the form of grants and contributions to organizations like the ones you'll hear about today, to organizations to enhance and support CRV initiatives, research and programming. And notably, we are currently accepting funding applications until January 11th, 2022. I would invite those interested to go have a look at our website. There's a lot more information there, including about an information session that will take place tomorrow, or two of them, one in English, et puis un autre en français. So now I wish to thank again everyone for being here, all the amazing panelists and all the work that's gone into organizing this, and would ask Jihan to take over. Go ahead, Jihan.
Thank you, Brett. Welcome everyone to our event. I am Jihan Rabah, Research Advisor at the Canada Centre for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence. It's my pleasure to be the moderator for this panel. As Brett has said, in order to support prevention and intervention, we need to anchor our actions in empirical evidence. We need to increase research capacity to better design and implement effective and evidence-based approaches and policies. I mean, after all, there is no single process of radicalization leading to violence, nor a common profile of individuals who become violently radicalized. Individual trajectories are shaped by complex interactions of push and pull factors to individuals and the social context in which they live. And that's why we need lots of trust, lots of cooperation, and lots of collaboration grounded in empirical evidence, of course, between all stakeholders involved. And that's exactly why we have lots of distinguished panelists and professionals surrounding us today to present and discuss the key findings of Canadian Practitioners Network systematic review on primary and secondary prevention programs. Welcome to all. Our distinguished panelists are Ghaida Hassan. Maybe Ghaida, you can show us just your hand. I'm sure everybody knows you already, but anyway, Director of, I'm gonna say CPN-PREV in short. Ghaida is a clinical psychologist and professor of clinical psychology at UQAM. Sébastien Brouillette-Alary, scientific coordinator of CPN-PREV. Sébastien, can we see you? Okay, Sébastien, we will see him soon, I guess. Scientific coordinator of CPN-PREV and instructor at the University of Montreal. Dimitri Pavlounis, who I'm not sure he's joined us, but he will be joining us very soon in the next 2 minutes. He's having just issues with the Zoom. He's a visiting professor of cinema and media studies at Carleton College. He also works at Civics, a Canadian NGO working in digital literacy and countering misinformation in the countering misinformation space, where he was responsible for developing the program called Control F. And last but not least, Felix Munger, Executive Director of Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention. Felix has a background in mental health, environmental studies, and a PhD in community psychology. So welcome to all. Before giving the floor to our panelists, let me just go over a few general guidelines and expectations for this session, since this webinar is currently live streamed on social media. In this session, we're committed to providing a respectful and harassment-free environment for everyone, regardless of gender identity and expression, sexual orientation, age, disability, race, ethnicity, or religion. As such, we're committed to a safe, open, and productive virtual session for everyone. Also, please do not forget to keep your microphones on mute during the entire webinar so that we minimize disturbance and echoes. Panel presentations will be followed by a question and answer period, during which we will invite you to type your questions in the chat. You can, of course, write your questions by using either official language, French or English. What else? I guess that's it from my side. I'm looking forward to an enriching discussion with all of you. Ghaida and Seb, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jihan, and thank you everybody for being here. This is amazing, and we hope that we will be able to transfer to you the synthesis of 2 years of extremely hard work in trying to systematically review a very, very heterogeneous set of evidence. So I will turn it on to Sébastien, who actually is sharing the PowerPoint that I hope everybody is seeing. And Sébastien and I will just dynamically, exchange the conversation about summarizing to you the state of knowledge today with regards to the, let's say, successful aspects, components of primary and secondary programs, but also the less successful one. Just before we start, Jihan said that maybe everybody knows me. I do not think so. So I will just take a few minutes to introduce CPN-PREV, which is the Canadian Practitioners Network on Prevention of Radicalization and Extremist Violence, and to say very briefly that CPN-PREV is a network that is founded by practitioners for practitioners. This is an evidence-based and practitioner-centered network. We do mapping exercises constantly in order to stay very, very close to the challenges that practitioners are facing in everyday life. We connect practitioners, we provide training, we mobilize knowledge, and most importantly, we try to work very hard in connecting spaces that traditionally tend to mistrust each other or tend to more difficultly connect, such as security spaces, non-security spaces, community, grassroots organizations, as well as the politics and the policy level. It is hard work, but again, it is really the solution to tackling such a complex phenomenon. So Sébastien, over to you. From time to time, I will also express myself in French. I know mainly in English, but I'll talk a little bit in French as well, recognizing that both French and English are the Canadian official languages. So Sébastien, à toi la parole.
Merci à tous d'être ici. Thanks for everybody to be here. So today we're going to look at the results of our second systematic review, which focuses on primary and secondary PVE programs. Today you have the short and sweet version of it, but if you want the longer, more detailed version, you can go on to the CPN-PREV website, in which the full 100+ page report figures. So you can go to cpnprev.ca/systematic review 2 to find the long version of the report. I'm going to talk a little bit about the relevance of systematic reviews. On the right side of the slide, you have what we call the pyramid of evidence, which goes from less solid to really solid study findings. So at the bottom, you have individual case reports, case series or studies, cohort studies, and then on the top of the methodological design strength, you have what we call randomized controlled trials. So for example, as is used in a vaccine development or medicine or stuff like that, less so in criminology for quite obvious ethical reasons. But and over that, you have systematic reviews and meta-analyses, which are studies that do not put together participants, but that put together other studies to really identify strong and solid central tendencies. Meta-analyses are really focused on quantitative reports and need a field where the literature is, first of all, quantitative and really focused on a specific outcome, which is maybe not the best or the best tool for a field. So as a field such as ours, systematic reviews enable two things. First of all, it enables the integration of qualitative studies, which are kind of numerous in this field and totally worthwhile. So we went to systematic review to really identify central tendencies in the field, while giving us the flexibility to really include a really large breadth of studies. So what we're going to try to do today is to, first of all, identify what works. So we're going to try to identify the successful programs, but also look into these programs to see if there were more or less successful components that were common to multiple programs. We're going to try to identify components that are that have been found to be not really effective without necessarily being iatrogenic. And we're also we're going to document what we can call iatrogenic effects. So in medicine, iatrogenic effects are effects that, for example, program components or modules that produce unintended negative side effects. So otherwise said, it's better to do nothing than to do these modules. And this will enable us to identify what we could call stigmatizing and oppressive practices in order to promote a do no harm way of intervention.
Absolutely. Seb, could you put it on PowerPoint mode? I think it will be easier for the participants to view.
Yeah, sure. Sure. So, because if I put it, it's going to take my full screen, and that's not what I want. So it's kind of complicated to set a custom slideshow. I'll just minimize the notes, but yeah, I cannot really put it full screen, or I could, but it's going to take some time.
Okay, so maybe while Seb puts it on full screen, as was requested by some of you, let me put a bit of context. I think that you know, with the movement around the prevention of violent radicalization and extremism, a lot of programs have been implemented. And a lot of programs have been implemented in urgency, in a way. And it is understandable, because at some point in time, we had to, you know, very quickly be able to handle both in post-vention and also in prevention of the attacks. The issue, however, is that several programs were, let's say, advertised, quote unquote, as effective. And several countries have tried to learn from each other and in implementing different programs, however, not cognizant or not aware of how actually are effective these programs. So for a while in the field of prevention of violent extremism, the effectiveness of program was much more a matter of opinion than actually a matter of robust empirical evidence. We do know as researchers and as practitioners as well that evaluation of programs is a very complex issue, and that it is difficult to evaluate programs. This being said, several studies have been published that have evaluated programs, but none yet were systematically integrated, reviewed, critically analyzed in terms of methodological robustness, and in terms also of, you know, theoretical connection and, you know, let's say, for example, logic models, theories of change behind these programs. And so we really needed to integrate this evidence in order to tell practitioners, policymakers, program funders, what is actually working in the field and what is not working, and what should be avoided in order to promote a do no harm approach. And so if we move slide, Seb, you can also take it from there if you want.
Yeah. I think I'm fine. So I hope it works for everybody. I finally found out how to maximize the PowerPoint in this specific window instead of my whole screen. So here you have an overview of the logic model. And what we're going to essentially define the various levels of prevention, as this systematic review is really focused on primary and secondary prevention. I'm going to do a little bit of publicity and mention that on December 10th, we're going to have a similar panel relating the results of tertiary prevention in the field. So primary prevention are initiatives that are directed at the whole population, whether they are at risk or not. So this could be, for example, counter-narrative campaigns that are linked with Google. This could be openness towards other programs that are disseminated in primary schools across the whole country, etc. Secondary prevention is prevention that targets individuals that are assumed to be at risk of radicalization. This could be because they are courted by extremist groups. This could be for a various number of reasons. But these individuals are assumed to be at risk of radicalization. That's why they are targeted by the secondary prevention intervention. And then we have tertiary prevention, which targets individuals that have already joined extremist groups or already committed acts of political violence, for example. So the objective of tertiary prevention is not to prevent the act, but to prevent what we would call recidivism or future acts for individuals that are already in the radicalization process. Here on the left, you have what is called targeted primary prevention, which is not an official term. It's kind of a term that we coined ourselves for systematic review. but is that we found a bunch of programs that were targeted at certain members of the community, whether they are at risk of radicalization or not. And this mostly concerns the PREVENT national strategy from the UK, which was perceived as targeting Muslim, whether they are at risk of radicalization or not, which of course will have effects as to their iatrogenic or stigmatizing effects. So in sum, the main question is, what are the main recommendations regarding primary and secondary prevention that can be generated from the literature? We're going to try to identify specific program components or modalities associated with a higher chance of success or failure. We have also assessed the quality of the literature in order to identify knowledge gaps and which studies that should be given more weight in the interpretation of results, for example, because they are more methodologically solid. And we have tried to formulate preliminary recommendations for program providers, policymakers, practitioners, and researchers. And as Heide mentioned, CPN-PREV is a practitioner-centered network, and one of the caveats of systematic reviews is often that they are done by researchers for researchers. So the recommendations that they come up with mostly concern future research efforts and how to better refine the methodological quality of studies, which can leave day-to-day practitioners kind of on their appetite for more concrete recommendations that addresses day-to-day practice and not necessarily research. So we really try to focus our systematic review recommendations and conclusions around a day-to-day practice and not necessarily future research, although we also did that in the full report. A really quick word about the methods. It is based on the Campbell collaboration systematic review methods, which is considered as mostly the gold standard in systematic review in social sciences. We included manuscripts written in English or French because these were languages common to the research team. The documents had to include an evaluation from primary data of any kind of primary, secondary PVE programs. And if this condition was met, there was no restriction for, let's say, a study design, a method or type, and we selected manuscripts up to June 2019. The search strategy was done with a library science expert. We included both peer-reviewed journals and gray literature, and know that the inter-regional agreement for the selection of study was substantial, but we're not going to talk too much about that. This is the PRISMA statement. It's more for archiving purposes that is there, but what there's to remember about that is among the 11,000 plus documents that we screened, 56 of them were eligible, so were on topic, so they contain primary data about the primary and secondary PVE programs. Among these, more than 20 of them were deemed to be of insufficient quality to be included in the review, and we were quite lenient in what we considered as methodologically adequate. So those that we excluded really had so few methodological details or conclusions so summarized that it was impossible to critically appraise them, so they were left out. So in the end, we had 33 studies about primary and secondary prevention in the review. And here's a kind of table to see from where these programs came from. So most of the programs came from Europe, more specifically UK in the PREVENT national PVE strategy. We also had studies from the Netherlands. There were some studies from North America, but unfortunately none from Canada. We had one study from Australia, 2 from Asia, and some also from Africa. In total, these 33 studies comprise in total 6,500 participants with a mean of around 200 participants per study. And what we see here is the type of violent radicalization targeted was heavily focused on violent Islamist radicalization. So 24 programs targeted violent Islamist radicalization, 9 targeted general violent radicalization. So basically violent radicalization processes without targeting a specific ideology, and 1 only targeted violent far-right radicalization. Program assessors were quite positive on the outcomes of these programs. So 18 evaluation reported positive outcomes mostly, 7 reported mixed outcomes, and 8 reported negative outcomes. And that's kind of a interest to underline, is that all of the negative assessments were related to initiatives under PREVENT in the UK.
Yeah. So what this basically means, just out of the results that Sébastien has provided so far, we can say one thing: there's not enough studies. That's already, from the 11,000 set to end up with 33 studies. This is, 33 studies is good, but it's really, really not enough in order to understand the effectiveness of programs that can be massively financially costly, but also, time consuming, human resource consuming. And so this is one first very important result. The second is the disequilibrium, if you want, between the countries or the continents where there are more or less studies. Now, fortunately enough, by the time this systematic review was published, a lot of evaluation studies are coming, so it will be worth it to update at some point in time. What it really shows, and we're jumping a little bit to the conclusions, but what it really shows is that there is a stark lack of, at least in French and English, studies around extreme far-right violent radicalization. And this is a major issue given the the widespread of the phenomenon. Now, mind you, there is a limit. There's probably a lot of research in the Northern European countries, but were not published in English, so we could not include them. And also in terms of overall effectiveness. So as Sébastien said, all negative assessments were related to initiative under Prevent UK. Prevent UK has been revised since, but I think it's important also to keep note that if other programs did not yield negative results, it's not necessarily because they did not have negative results. It's because the researchers who evaluated the programs did not assess for the presence of negative results. So I think this is a very important issue to keep in mind in terms of evaluation. Robust, good evaluations must always assess, both for positive and negative outcomes. Negative outcomes does not mean that the program has to be thrown away, not at all. But it's very important because these negative outcomes inform very well on at least what should not be done. Back to you, Sébastien.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Now we're going to go to the main conclusions that were generated from the systematic reviews. And this is directly about what we were discussing, is that first of all, programs that target a specific ethnic or religious group, in this case, Muslim communities by the PREVENT strategy, generated more negative and iatrogenic effects than benefits. So some of them led to positive outcomes in some cases, but most of them were viewed negatively, and not only by the let's say Muslim participants, but also by the personnel, so also by the stakeholders and staff working for the program that were kind of they were not at ease with the program that they were dispensing. And here we feel that the core mistake of these so-called targeted primary prevention programs is the fact that they conflate risk of radicalization with belonging in a specific community, when the more realistic assessment is that among members of each communities, there are some of them that are at risk of radicalization. And when you build a program that targets all the members of the community without necessarily targeting the at-risk members, then obviously these will lead to feelings of discrimination and stigmatization for these communities, which can have adverse effects as it relates to radicalization. So it's really counterproductive. The second conclusion is kind of linked to the first one, is that programs that focus on surveillance method, monitoring and control. So for example, there were censorship programs in universities that tried to censor the access of students to certain radical content. And in this case, it was mostly Muslim-related radical content and not other type of radical content, which is problematic in itself. There were also hotline programs and stuff like that. So these surveillance programs that were kind of a mix of intervention, but also security programs, these generated more negative iatrogenic effects than benefits. So university staff were usually reluctant to put these programs into motion. And the students and even the staff declare negative outcomes such as fear of being spied upon, self-censorship, stigmatization of Muslim communities, and Muslim students overall not feeling like they belong to the British student community because of these programs.
And so what these two main conclusions speak to is actually the fact that both, mostly programming, I'd say, but also evaluative research, but mostly programming, at least in the beginning, in the first phases or the first years of programming, was really infused with ideological biases that have generated, unfortunately, and that continue to generate major blind spots in terms of who is considered at risk and in terms of the type of programming and who is actually defined as being at risk. And this is an important conclusion that I think should be seriously taken into consideration in the design of future programs, because it does speak of strong inherent biases that trickle through from the security down or left or right, whatever you put things, to the health sector, to the education sector and the community sector. And the consequences of such iatrogenic or negative effects on communities, as Sébastien said, can really fuel further chilling effects in communities, further issues related to mistrust of these types of prevention programs, and also, stigmatization associated with further radicalization. So there are really important lessons to be taken also, not just from the positive results, but most importantly from the negative ones.
And to clarify another point, we're not saying that programs should not be tailored to their audience. This is not the same thing as targeting members of a community and assuming they are at risk of radicalization, which is seems to be a no-no, obviously. But this is not the same thing as actually tailoring a program for its audience. And we have no reason to doubt that tailoring is good. Targeting and assuming that the community is at risk is the problem here. Next conclusion, there were police community partnership or programs that were assessed, and they have produced mixed findings, and these are mostly due to research design. The evaluation studies focused on the subjective perceptions of police officers and stakeholders, so basically people that put the program into place, and also perception from community partners. And as expected, those that put the program in place thought that it was absolutely great. So police officers reported and stakeholders reported feelings of empowerment, acknowledgement, and mutual trust. And where that becomes problematic is that when we also interviewed community partners, the views that they expressed kind of contrasted with those of the program providers. They declared trust issues with the police and feelings of discrimination because of the program. And that obviously led to implementation issues because the community that was consulted to implement the program was reluctant to the program, and for potentially, as we said earlier, good reasons. So that's for police community partnerships. And now on to better news, because we also have good news. Primary and secondary prevention program seemed to be effective in improving characteristics that are documented as protective factors against violent radicalization. So programs were successful in improve characteristics such as empathy towards others, openness towards other, conflict management skills, which can help to prevent violent radicalization to take root in individuals. So the programs were generally successful in improving these characteristics. So for example, they did pre-post measures, and they found that after the programs, participants had overall improved their empathy or openness towards others, etc. The only caveat here is that improvement in predictive factors cannot be assumed to reduce the risk of violence or involvement in a violent radical trajectory. This is the difference between intermediate and final outcomes. So for example, if a program does improve self-esteem in participants, then the intermediate outcome, which is self-esteem, is indeed improved. Now the question that remains is, does improvement on self-esteem actually prevent individuals from engaging in a violent radical trajectories? Does improving self-esteem decreases, for example, violent radical attitudes or behaviors? And this is referred to as the final outcome. So the problem is that most of the program evaluation did declare success in improving intermediate outcomes, but now the question is, does it also have a final outcome, which is, for example, reducing violent radical attitudes or behavior? And there were programs that, and I'll leave the mic to Haida in a second, but just to clarify, there were actually programs that measured both intermediate and final outcomes. So we have the characteristics that are most often associated to real success. So up to you, Haida.
Yeah, so I think what this speaks to, and likely for the next generation of research, but also it speaks to practitioner perspective. So in terms of research, I think what we need, and this is the big challenge, is that missing nexus between those, let's say, more proximal or more immediate outcomes and the intermediate and final outcomes. And we need some documentation around that, because in the field, there tend to be sometimes a polarized position around primary, secondary versus tertiary programs. And sometimes there is a lot of questioning around funding and supporting primary prevention programs, using the argument that, well, you know, these programs do not prevent an attack from happening. They're not intended to. They are intended to reduce, from a public health perspective, let's say, the sources of vulnerability and risk that then make people, so the sources of risk, and increase the protective factors that make people more or less vulnerable to entering a trajectory of violent radicalization. But if we find that missing link, and one example of a missing link is exactly around the issue of self-esteem. So while at times we can consider self-esteem as a protective factor in and by itself, when you look at risk and trajectories and sometimes characteristics of people who have engaged in violent radical attacks, improving self-esteem may actually become a double-edged sword, because it may become a risk factor for actual violence. And so what we need in terms of future programming is to exactly look at how these protective factors link to the final outcomes, and in their link to the final outcomes, do they shift? So what actually are the markers then of positive or negative change in a trajectory? And if we get to that point, then we can go back on the primary and secondary programming and more effectively target or more efficiently target factors that we now know are protective all the way from the short to the final term in terms of a person's trajectory. Je repasse à toi, Seb.
Merci. Another finding is, and we hinted at that earlier, is that among the 33 studies reviewed, none evaluated prevention programs targeting left-wing radicalization or single-issue violent radicalization. This could be, for example, misogyny-related radicalization, for example, incel. And only one targeted the far right, and it targeted the far right and Muslim radicalization. So this suggests that some quite currently prevalent types of radicalization do not receive the appropriate consideration by researchers, funders, and program developers. As Haida said, that could be because some evaluations were conducted but were not made available to the public, which is another problem in itself. And this potentially stems from the fact that for us to, well, for assessors to evaluate programs, it requires a lot of time. The program has to run its through, and then results have to be analyzed by a researcher, and that takes some time. So obviously, most of the programs that were put in place post 9/11 and consequently targeted violent Islamist radicalization are the ones on which we have data right now, 10 or 20 years later. But we would hope that in the coming years, data would accumulate on, for example, program targeting the far right, because this is definitely a problem of our time in North America, but also in other sections of the world. The far right has really risen recently, and we hope that some programs are available for these individuals and that they will be assessed for subsequent improvement. Another finding is that data is currently scarce concerning the implementation challenges of PVE programs. So what went well and what went wrong in the implementation of these programs? Were they sufficiently funded? Was there staff problems, etc.? And in primary and secondary prevention research, there are really few studies that report the implementation challenges. And interestingly, that is not the case with tertiary PVE programs, where we have some process evaluations of the implementation that really relates the challenges and successes of these programs. So I guess stay tuned on the 10th of December for these. But for primary and secondary PVE programs, we had few data concerning implementation challenges. We are aware that this is also due to the scientific publication process, in which articles are kind of the short and sweet of your results, and you do not have space to potentially talk about these implementation challenges. But and so insofar, the gray literature may be more adapted than official literature for that. But in any case, in primary and secondary prevention, we had gray literature, and still implementation challenges were not covered, at least not super well. And I'm going to end my section of the presentation by talking about our own limitations and limitation inherent to systematic reviews. And this will open the way for our panelists, which is one of the main problems with systematic reviews, is that they highlight big picture results. They put multiple studies together so to really identify central tendencies, but kind of unzooming from the day-to-day practice means that that the results or recommendations stemming from systematic reviews may lack concrete application, they may lack nuance or precision. And that's why the dialogue between researchers, but also on-the-ground practitioners, is so important to move the field forward. And since CPN-PREV is a practitioner-centered network, that's what we tried to do. So in a certain way, results from program evaluation, they come from program participants, but also stakeholders and program providers. But now that we have these conclusions based on these studies, we're going to return to these program stakeholders and program providers to ask them to actually improve the recommendations that we made. So it's kind of a way to stay humble towards a recommendation. And so we submitted them these recommendations and ask them to suggest improvements or tell us if the recommendation is flat out wrong, or how can we make it more concrete so that it speaks more to day-to-day practitioners. So this kind of iterative review process is known as a Delphi process, and now we're currently closing the last wave of our Delphi process for primary and secondary PVE recommendations. So stay tuned for more. And in the meantime, today we're super lucky to have discussants with on-the-ground experience, as I said, to contextualize, review, and comment on our recommendations and how they may relate to their practice, or how can their practice inform our recommendation, to really have a dialogue.
Thank you, Seb. So before we pass it on back to Jihan, I just wanted to mention as well that the picture is quite interesting and has quite some differences with intervention programs. So again, December 10, if you're ever available, because what we have done, in addition to, of course, engaging the systematic reviews in a Delphi process, is actually we've extracted, and in a chapter hopefully to appear soon, all the risk and protective factors that were addressed in all those different primary, secondary, and tertiary programs, and we contrasted them with risk and protective factor from literature on CVE generally, but also on more generally around violence, to see as well how these different programs seem to target risk factors that are supported by evidence from another sector, or whether some previously established risk factors have also not been taken into consideration by these programs. Permettez-moi juste de terminer en français, s'il vous plaît. Ce que je vais faire, c'est résumer très rapidement les conclusions majeures des revues systématiques pour dire que globalement, ce que cette revue systématique sur les facteurs primaires et secondaires nous montre, c'est que les programmes qui visent une communauté en particulier et qui donc mélangent au fait de manière erronée l'appartenance ethnique, religieuse ou genre comme étant un facteur de risque, ont des conséquences principalement et des effets principalement néfastes et stigmatisants sur les communautés. Les programmes police-communauté ont des résultats mitigés, souvent en raison de la qualité méthodologique des études, mais les évaluations sur les programmes de prévention primaire et secondaire montrent en général des effets positifs sur ce qu'on appelle les facteurs de protection distaux, c'est-à-dire ceux qui ne sont pas très proximales ou très proches de l'agir violent, mais ceux qui protègent les individus contre le fait de devenir à risque de sombrer dans un agir violent. Mais j'avais fait une petite nuance par rapport à ça, dans le sens qu'un facteur de protection, disons dans les niveaux plus distaux, peut devenir un facteur de risque dans une trajectoire plus proche de la violence. Et finalement, le fait qu'aucune étude n'a porté sur la radicalisation d'extrême droite violente, ce qui est vraiment quelque chose de... D'ailleurs, non plus sur la radicalisation d'extrême gauche violente ou des mouvements qu'on va dire à cause spécifique comme les mouvements misogynes. Donc, la recherche future doit vraiment se diriger vers ça. Bon, voilà. Je voulais vraiment pour les francophones et francophiles ici, quand même résumer un tout petit peu les résultats. So thank you very much, and I'm very eager to hear our panelists' comments on this very brief description of results.
Thank you so much, Ghaida and Seb, for the comprehensive overview in English and in French. I would like to remind everyone that if you'd like to take a look at the report itself, the link is in the chat. And now I would like to hand the floor over to Felix. Felix?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to respond to this. Thank you, CPN-PREV and the Canada Centre. Can I see a quick sign? Can people hear me? Wait, I can't actually see anyone. Okay, you can hear me. Good. That's always the first part when the presenter comes on and all you can see is a moving mouth and nothing else is happening. So again, thank you very much. My name is Felix and I work for the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention, and I'm coming to you today from the Waterloo region, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Neutrals people of Canada. I'm really pleased and happy to be here, and I was asked to provide some thoughts and how this may apply. And going through this, I'm going to, after a very quick presentation on who we are and what we actually do, I'm going through and tell you a little bit what came to mind, as in what some of the first thoughts that came to mind when I was reading the review and was thinking about how to respond and how the findings, how they play out in our world, in the world of crime prevention and community safety and well-being. And generally speaking, I can tell you that some of the similar conundrums, the conundrums of primary prevention, secondary prevention, targeted work, police, community relationships, and I'll go into this a little bit more in detail. But let me start first with who we are. So the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention has been around actually for quite a while, and it was just like CPN-PREV, founded as a network by practitioners for practitioners. It's morphed into an organization that has at its mission is really building the capacity and mobilizing communities across Canada to prevent and reduce crime, including violence. And essentially for us, the vision is to create a Canada that is safe that is safe, healthy, and inclusive as a country. So how do we go about this? If I could have the next slide. Again, similar to what CPN-PREV does, it's we bring practitioners together. In our case, we often bring communities together to exchange, to talk about what they're experiencing, what's working for them. We have knowledge dissemination and training. And really, at the end of the day, we are here to create awareness for municipal stakeholders, a commitment to crime prevention, particularly crime prevention through social development and upstream approaches, a commitment to evidence-based crime prevention, which this review is a really beautiful way of thinking about this, increase capacity and looking at innovation. And that, as I said, the idea is to, and the outcome is to reduce crime and victimization. And we do this largely, we work with a lot of communities, and some of you may have heard this. There's a lot of shift, a language shift that's happening in the Canadian context around what used to be called crime prevention is now increasingly called community safety and well-being. Often communities develop their own plans. In a nutshell, the beauty about this is moving from crime prevention to community safety and well-being. The beauty about this is it opens it up. It doesn't, as soon as somebody hears crime, they think about policing. And so now community safety and well-being is really providing a framework to think about the social determinants of crime or the social determinants of violence. It has been allowing to open this up, and we produce documents. I do want to say, though, what's possible in when a network like CPN-PREV is within the context or so closely related to a university, being able to do a systematic review, that is not something we can do. We are focusing very much on practitioner capacity. So what's the relevance? So this is what I was really asked to talk about. Well, relevance is more than I thought to begin with, which is an interesting observation. And I think this was quite fantastic for us. So obviously, for us, focus on community safety includes any type of violence, be it violence that's radicalized violence or be it violence in homes, intimate partner violence. So this is a component of work that we're actually, I think historically haven't thought enough about, but more importantly, the way we are observing what's happening in communities across the country, we may need to pay much more attention to violence based on radicalization or radicalization that turns to violence. With regards to the review directly, one of the things, of course, is recognize the recognition of how programs and projects more at the primary prevention piece, the way I understand it, that aim to improve openness, respect, and dialogue. The value of these is something that stood out, and I think we, as in our own networks, don't support that enough, that local communities bring these kind of programs, for example, into their educational system, even though we actually, the way it's conceptualized and the way we do the work is bringing education, healthcare, social service, CD enforcement together. So that's something to think about for us in the future. The potential harm of a national strategy, if even with the best intentions, how it can actually potentially harm people. And there is two specific learnings, and there may be not so much learnings as they are glad to hear that this is not just our experience, and that's how and when to target specific groups. Because we see similar experiences. This is largely around BIPOC communities on the streets of your communities where you live, how oftentimes they're being targeted, and they're not this conflation of belonging to a group and potentially being radicalized. We're seeing similar conflation, I think, between being a BIPOC person of BIPOC and at the same time being, obviously it's not about radicalization, but it's about criminalization. And so it actually happens then in some cases where people are being criminalized through simply belonging to a particular group. And then the second piece, and that's actually very much linked to the first, this first part that I think is really important for us to consider as well. And hearing this was really good for me because it provided more evidence for something that we've already known, but isn't enough said. And maybe if I say it back to you, you're understanding that even if not exactly the same world, but these are the same issues. So this is the issue with police community partnerships. Again, and this actually goes back to the first part. There's two components that come always, and this is police in school. Is it we hear voices saying we need police officers back in school, and some that are saying no. And the issue there, of course, is, and many of you will know this, but research is pretty clear that, well, it does work for white children in schools. It creates a good relationship, but it doesn't for BIPOC. And I'm back to the targeted, some of the smaller groups. It actually doesn't work for police officers in school. Most of the studies show it's not good for BIPOC community members in school. And so also the idea, of course, is, and it often comes again, this is an important relationship between the community and policing. Furthermore, and we hear this all the time, I don't know how many of you are aware of the DARE program. It's a drug abuse, oh my God. So it's a police-led drug abuse reduction education program that has been done. And we keep on hearing this, community members saying, we need this program back. It was so good. Police come back and say, this was such a good program. But there is in no database could we find that there is actually suggestion that it works. And I think it's really fantastic that CPN-PREV embarked on this kind of work and looking systematically and doing a systematic review on programs that are around, because there is gonna be programs out there that people are saying these work and they don't actually work. They can have the opposite experience. So there is good for police and people in the community that think that's working, but actually there is nothing that would suggest that there's positive outcomes. So I have two more things that I would like to address, if I can have the next slide, and then I want to make space for the next responder. So one, obviously, we are also with the Canada Centre, through the Canada Centre, working on a project which is on the role of educational institutions and school professionals in the prevention of social polarization and radicalization leading to violence. So lots of what this report actually said is very, very applicable to the work that we're doing. And then we have two challenges that we're seeing increasingly in communities, and this work is going to come in here. We're seeing an increasing challenge of social disorder, and with that comes social polarization. So social disorder because of, or seen as an issue because of homeless people or people that are experiencing homelessness, encampments, could be sex workers and substance users, particularly around safe consumption site. And there is an increasing amount of language in communities across the country around vigilantism, of a more so right-wing, right ideology, thinking about actually using violence against people who are already experiencing homelessness, living in encampments, trying to survive on sex work. So that's the one piece. The second piece, and that's my last slide, is something that we have been starting to explore more so, and that's the current challenges, climate change and urban security or urban safety. Again, we're seeing an increase in social polarization. So first I should probably say, climate change is going to increase the risk in communities around urban safety. And there isn't enough attention being paid to this issue per se. And what we're seeing is an increase in social polarization. That's both on right-wing and then radical environmental groups, this polarization. And with an increase in climate change extreme events, as we are seeing on a pretty regular basis, and this will come faster and faster and faster, there is a good chance that there will be more of that. And already until now, we've seen that Hurricane Katrina, people were using this as blaming LGBTQ communities, for example, on Hurricane Katrina, and the whole social polarization around when Black people were filmed going into stores getting water, they were considered, they were described as looters. When it was white people, the language around this is these are white people that are trying to survive. So already this polarization, and with more extreme weather events, there will be more polarization. And I'm going to leave you with a last piece that will make all this work so important, is using climate change for social polarization. What's happening at this point is internationally, the right, who has until now, the extreme right, who has until now often denied climate change, are now saying climate change is real. And they're using climate change now for social polarization. And there again, there's a risk with, and I want to be clear, I recognize polarization and radical thinking isn't always a bad thing, but there is a risk that that kind of thinking, immigrants result in pollutants, carbon dioxide. That's why we want to keep immigrants out. This is the same in Germany. There's some of the same language. And Marine Le Pen talking about creating world's leading ecological civilization for France, and saying environmentalism is the natural child of patriotism. So using what's happening around climate change. And this for us, and what you've done here, is incredibly powerful and useful for us when communities will increasingly face these kind of challenges, that we have something in our pocket that we can use to support communities in this area. So slightly longer than I intended. Back to you, Jihan.
No, it's amazing. Thank you so much, Felix, for giving us such a comprehensive overview of the CMNCP work and the challenges and everything that you're facing, and your actually relevance and response to the systematic review. I would like to hand it over now to Dimitri from Civics. Dimitri, over to you.
Hi, thanks so much. Can everybody hear me? Good, perfect. So first of all, I want to thank the organizers of the event for inviting Civics to participate, and of course the authors of this report for doing such important work. So as Jihan mentioned, my name is Dimitri. I'm here representing Civics. Next slide, please. So Civics is an education charity dedicated to building the habits and skills of citizenship among youth through experiential learning programs used by K-12 educators. So our flagship program is Student Vote, which is a parallel election program that coincides with general elections across Canada. But over the last 4 years, our focus has expanded quite significantly to include a deep emphasis on informed citizenship as a response to the current crisis around online disinformation. And this is culminated in our most recent program, the one I'll discuss today. Next slide, please. Which is Control F, our digital literacy program developed alongside digital literacy expert Mike Caulfield from the University of Washington. Digital literacy is, of course, an enormous umbrella term, but the Control F program focuses specifically on teaching the habits and skills required to evaluate and assess online information. So it aims to empower teachers to teach students how to distinguish between true and false, but also, and maybe more importantly, how to navigate all of the misleading, emotionally charged, agenda-driven information that falls into those gray areas between true and false. We've recently concluded a major research project evaluating the efficacy of the program in collaboration with some partners at Stanford and at City University of New York in an attempt to develop some empirically grounded best practices. And I'll say a bit more about that study later. So typically when we frame this work, we do so in terms of its capacity to encourage informed citizenship within a democratic society, right? So as young people turn to online information to help them make and shape decisions that they make about themselves and about their communities, we want to ensure that they have the best possible tools to make the best possible decisions about what information to trust. Yet as this work necessarily and increasingly needs to address topics like disinformation and polarizing and radicalizing content, I think it's become much more clear to us that we have much to learn from the work that is being done in PVE. So before continuing, I want to stress that as an organization, Civics is not historically engaged explicitly with PVE, and I don't come to this topic as an expert, but we have recently been thinking about how our current work intersects with some of the goals of PVE. So I want to use kind of the remainder of my remarks first to sketch out what I see as some meaningful overlaps between and challenges really between our work, and then conclude with a few comments about some of the major questions that the systemic report has helped raise about the limitations of civics' own work and potential avenues for future research. Next slide, please. So, from our vantage point, which is, the digital literacy side, we often see articles like with headlines like this one about how, media literacy or digital literacy or information literacy can help prevent radicalization. And I think it's easy to see why that connection is so frequently made and why digital literacy is framed quite often as a form of primary prevention with, potential impact, at least on intermediate outcomes. We know anecdotally, for instance, that, Dylan Roof claims that he was partially radicalized by a few Google searches gone awry, which led him down the route of white supremacy. Right, and as the authors of, this report noted in a 2018 report, we still really do need more evidence before we can draw a straight line between exposure to extremist online information and offline violent outcomes. But right, there's nevertheless this general assumption that digital literacy programming is an important, if insufficient, condition to preventing radicalization. Right, this is often presented as a given, as a settled question. As such, as somebody from the digital literacy side, I was disappointed to not see any digital literacy initiatives or programs with digital literacy components, as far as I could tell, represented in that final sample of the report. Disappointed, but I guess not completely surprised, because the truth is the literature on digital literacy programming provides many of the same challenges that the authors identified with the literature on PVE programming. There is a similar lack of rigorous empirical evaluation of media literacy programming in general, combined with an assumption that any programming is better than nothing at all. So as a result, there are lots of calls for digital literacy programming as a response to a variety of social ills, but minimal consensus in terms of what form these programs should take, what success looks like, or what approaches constitute evidence-based best practices. And even when it comes to something as seemingly narrow as source evaluation, there are myriad proposed approaches, many of them contradictory. So in other words, maybe it's really not that surprising that there doesn't seem to be the strong evidence linking digital literacy to PVE programming, since we're still in the early stages of developing evidence-based best practices in both fields. But making matters worse, and I think further underlining how urgently we need to study this issue and maybe combine forces, is that one thing we do know is that some approaches to digital literacy can have potentially harmful effects. Though again, the precise extent to which certain approaches cause harm needs to be investigated further. But for instance, some media scholars express concern that approaches that emphasize suspicion and doubt, so a kind of question everything approach to online information, can actually lead young people away from expertise and toward fringe content. Next slide, please. More concretely, we know that some basic digital literacy strategies that are currently widely taught can lead people toward more extreme online content. For example, we know that young people still tend to be taught that websites with a URL ending in .org are inherently trustworthy. And this is despite the fact that, as the Stanford History Education Group found in a study, many sites that have been designated hate sites have a .org URL. Next slide, please. And we've seen this play out in practice in Canada. So earlier I mentioned Civics' recent research to evaluate the effect of our digital literacy program on students' ability to evaluate online information. So to do this, we used a pre-test, post-test design with a sample of more than 2,300 students from across Canada. Next slide, please. And the pretest provided insight into students' habits prior to going through the program, and the results of the pretest were not encouraging. So I can go into more details later if you'd like, but this is always the one that really stands out. This is the one example that, or the result that stands out the most to me. So in this case, we showed students the website for the American College of Pediatricians, a group that presents itself as a major professional medical organization, but that is actually an anti-LGBTQ advocacy group. And at pretest, only 6% of students were able to determine that this site had an agenda. Most students simply accepted it at face value as a major professional organization, a site of good medical research, including this student here who trusts it again because of the URL. Next slide, please. The good news is that the post-test results were promising. So on a post-test taken 6 weeks following the program, for example, now nearly 50% of students were able to determine the agenda of, in this case, an anti-vax group that presented itself as an independent research organization. Next slide, please. Moreover, teacher responses like this one suggest that the program might be promising for the purposes of primary prevention. But of course, right now, this is purely anecdotal evidence. So while our results and a growing body of literature evaluating similar methods suggest that we are moving in the direction of developing best practices for digital literacy and source evaluation, when it comes to this bigger question of, what does digital literacy actually have to do with PVE, if anything, the answer is still that we don't really know. And indeed, reading this systemic review has helped clarify what it is that we don't know and what claims we can and can't make given the limited focus of our own research and its emphasis on skills acquisition and application. So as excited as we are by our results, I think we've learned through engaging with this document that there's still so much work to be done to study the long-term effects of these skills on behavior, right? So we know that the skills can direct young people to higher quality information and give them tools necessary to contextualize information, but we don't have concrete evidence that skills acquisition in a classroom setting helps us achieve other relevant intermediate outcomes, such as change in habits or attitudes. We don't know the extent to which pre-existing biases or exposure to emotionally charged content might circumvent the application of some of these skills during day-to-day online interactions. Furthermore, while our program was developed and designed to address known harmful effects of traditional media literacy approaches, we did not test specifically for new iatrogenic outcomes that may have arisen from our approach. And this is definitely a recommendation that I want to build into further evaluations in the future. And given how little rigorous evaluation of digital literacy initiatives occur in the first place, I don't know if any organizations are actively investigating these questions. And at least in the case of civics, doing so would require expertise that we don't have given the nature of our organization. We would like to be able to claim that our approach to digital literacy could be productively adapted and incorporated into existing PVE programming, but we just don't know if that's the case, and determining this would necessarily require significant collaboration between digital literacy and PVE subject matter experts. So I guess from our perspective, an important next step would be to study the effect of evidence-based digital literacy strategies with an eye to the application in the service of PVE programming, following the recommendations as outlined in this report. But doing this effectively would, again, require collaboration and guidance at all stages of program design, implementation, and evaluation. And this, of course, I think leads to some of the issues that are really at the heart of this review. Because while I completely agree that there's an urgent need for more and better design studies to evaluate the effectiveness of PVE programs and really of all educational programming, I would guess. No, I think the paucity of rigorous studies is a symptom of larger systemic issues that impede this type of work. And these issues can range from funding structures that don't support this level of rigorous evaluation to the internal capacity of the organizations themselves. And having just kind of completed a project that aspired to some level of rigor, I can't help but wonder, how that type of work could even be sustainable long-term. So I guess the question I kind of want to end with is, how do we form more sustainable bridges between research and practice in this space? The review has very clearly identified an urgent need. So what can we do to put some of the recommendations into practice, given the material and organizational constraints faced by many practitioners and organizations? And I think I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dimitri. Now I would like to take it back to Ghaida and Seb, just to ask you if you'd like to add anything before we open the floor for the participants for questions and answers period. I know that we are supposed to be finishing in 3:30, so we'll have barely 10 minutes. So I'd like please to just remind the participants if you'd like to post your questions in the chat in both official languages, and turn it over quickly to Ghaida and Seb. Thank you.
I just wanted to thank Felix and Dimitri for their highly pertinent remarks, and really absolutely everything that was highlighted and recommended is so key, and Felix for pointing us to the challenge of the next era that we all will be facing. Jehan, I'll leave it to you. I saw one question.
Actually, if I can say a quick word, specifically directed to Dimitri. So thanks for your presentation. Actually, I was not aware of the well, before that, of the program, and it's super interesting. And one of the things that we didn't have time to present, because we only have so much time with all of you today, is that we also looked at the components, and Haida told about it, but at the components that were more often associated with success or failure. And one of the components that was consistently well regarded in studies as effective and actually related to final outcomes. So not only the programs were effective in improving the characteristic, but also the improvement in the characteristic was associated with a decrease in violent radical attitudes and behaviors. And one of these components was civic education and social engagement programs that were consistently highlighted in primary and secondary PVE, but also in tertiary PVE programs as really effective and a safe bet, if I can say, for intervention. So even though you did not have the time to thoroughly evaluate civics, the current literature suggests that there could be good stuff in there.
Thank you, Seb. Okay, so I think it's about time to open up the floor for the participants' questions. I'm going to read out the first question from Frédéric Moret. So Frédéric is asking, would the panelists have thoughts on mentoring programs such as practiced by Aarhus University in Denmark and in infancy with CPN-PREV in Montreal? The info presented today in the study seems to focus more on who the studied program targeted rather than the methods of the program. Thank you, Frédéric, for the question, and I'll hand it back to Raida and Seb or whoever from the panelists would like to respond.
Seb, I can invite you to jump in. So as I responded in the chat, actually in the tertiary review, we looked at that, and Seb has kind of provided a beginning of the answer. We did actually look at what components of program yielded what kind of results. In prevention, in primary prevention, that was a huge challenge because of the extreme heterogeneity of programs, but also the lack of information on programs themselves, on methods of programs. In relation to mentoring, for example, we found practically nothing around evaluation of mentoring directly. We know from other fields of studies that mentoring or mentorship programs are promising, provided that certain conditions are satisfied. And that is including very close support provided to the mentors and understanding basically of their role, even clinically, because I'm a practitioner and I work in a clinical team with individuals that are affected or on the path of violent radicalization. We do have a mentoring program, and the challenges that we see often relate to the boundaries of mentoring and really having to accompany mentors in their role because of the specific boundaries and the challenges that often people with very complex trajectories and multiple needs face with that. So I wish, Frédéric, I could have told you, yes, there are 10 studies that have evaluated mentoring programs, but it does not. However, there are, for those of you who really want to look at the components of programs, we have information on that, and we're more than happy to provide you with.
Thank you. Would the participants have any other question? Please post it in the chat. In the meantime, I have a question to Raida and Seb. Basically, while reading the results of this systematic review, I was like a little bit kind of searching if there were any results on gender sensitive approaches, methodologies, or results. And I was kind of like surprised that there isn't anything. So can you please speak to that?
I can speak the same surprise that you have, Jihan. The field predominantly targets male participants. Programs predominantly as well target male participants. I think we can go search and take a look and take out the number of female participants. And even when they target male, because gender sensitive is not about women, right? It's about the entire larger category of gender. There doesn't seem to be any analysis of gender issues, no analysis of intersectional issues either, meaning, okay, so my participants in relation to gender, in relation to their age, and in relation to their, let's say, ethnic, religious, or other protected identity factors, where are they situated in the program and how they are affected or not by the program? We are not at that stage. The literature that we reviewed was far from getting there in terms of analyzing the effects of programs. So this is definitely something that we need to go forward with in terms of new future programming and future evaluation programs.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Would anyone like to add anything? I think, Aida, you have a response from Frederic. I'm not going to read it out loud, but I'm just going to ask participants if they have a question. In the meantime, I have one more question for you, which is basically, I was like, with regards to the results regarding the police community partnerships, and that it has more like to do with the research methodologies. So I was wondering if Seb, as the scientific coordinator of CPN-PREV, can you talk to us a little bit more about this finding?
Yeah, absolutely. As we mentioned, the main problem of these studies, and this is a problem that was also found in other studies. So it's not only the police community partnership programs that are liable of this, is that sometimes it's easier to measure user satisfaction toward the program. So whether participants found the program good or great or useful or etc., and whether program not participants but program staff also felt the same way, felt that the program really helped them to improve a certain skill among their participants. And this is obviously a convenient way to do things, but ideally there would also be measures closer to the constructive interest. So, for example, if you want, if you have a let's say, empathy program, or let's see, let's move to another field, a program that aimed to help against, let's say, depression, psychological program against depression, and then you do not want to only ask participants whether they felt the program was useful. You want to maybe have a self-revealed depression inventories that are validated in the field, such as the Beck depression inventory. And this can be measured pre-program and then post-program to see if there's an improvement. So we want to have measures that go beyond the user satisfaction and have measures that are closer to the constructive interest, as I said. And another problem with these police partnership programs is that they mostly ask those that provided the program if they were satisfied by the program in question. So while ideally we do want to have feedback from the program providers, but we also really want feedback for those that went through the actual program, and not only those that gave it, as this can obviously lead to biases in the answers. So obviously those that worked in the program are predisposed to view it more positively than the participants of these programs.
Thank you. Yeah, it makes sense, definitely. Thank you so much. We have a question from Gabrielle Larivière to the panelists. So I guess to Raida and Seb. To what extent do you think that studies looking at push and pull factors can help bridge the gap between intermediary and final results of PVE programs?
So I can see also somebody has a question for Felix. But I will answer very quickly that question so that we can give time to Felix to answer, because I think he has to leave imminently to another meeting. I just lost the question. I'm trying to reread it again to make sure that I will provide.
What extent?
Yeah, the push and pull factors. So
okay, yes.
I think, Gabrielle, I think the key is not so much because what is happening in literature right now is that it's looking at push and pull factor in a static way, not in a dynamic trajectory fashion. Which we can learn a lot from studies in the criminology side, for example. So it's not so much about understanding what are the push and pull factors that are playing out there, but it is really to understand how these push and pull factors dynamically interact within a trajectory of a person. And we have some studies on trajectories. And I think this is the way that in the future, this is where studies should go. They should go on trajectory analysis rather than statically, picking up risk and protective factors, because they interplay in such a different way among different individuals. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the answer I can quickly give you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Felix, over to you. So the question is, the question is from Grace Choi. What our colleague from the government, from the federal government. So Grace is asking, what was it about the DARE program at the time that rendered it so well received by many, despite the lack of data regarding positive outcomes? Would it be possible to reconfigure that kind of program for current needs?
Okay, so let me try to answer this in a minute or less than that by now. So DARE was actually about drug abuse education, and it brought in police officers into schools. And I think this is the conundrum that you guys were finding, is that so many programs are out there that don't have enough resources put to it to do good enough evaluation. Now, in the DARE context, they did evaluation, but of course, DARE's outcomes were not achieved. So DARE's outcomes of the drug abuse education wasn't achieved to the degree it was meant to be. So it is not, if you look at crimesolutions.gov, the US National Department of Justice, they're very clear it doesn't work as a program. But it was, of course, looking at it in terms of what its outcome was supposed to be. So, and the outcome was supposed to have to do with drug use of youth. So that didn't work. The perceived, and this is the important piece, this is about a perceived piece, the perceived piece about this is good for the relationship. We don't know enough about it, and that wasn't the question. So that particular program, but it has been perceived by a lot of people as positive. And trust me, I think a rebuilding, and more so today than 10, 20 years ago, but rebuilding the trust between police and society, which I think is starting to look a little bit like a broken contract. And but like a broken social contract. And I'm not blaming anyone on this side. This is not my point. My point is there is a broken social contract that we're starting to see, where the trust in police and the police's trust maybe into the communities isn't there anymore. And that needs to be rebuilt. And I'm not saying this. I think there's a lot of necessity to actually look at that and rebuild this kind of trust, keeping in mind that it's not always as straightforward as we think it is by just bringing the two groups together, to be very mindful in terms of how this approach actually looks like and who from both sides comes together. So the short answer would have been yes. It can be done, but it probably shouldn't be done around the DARE program, who if I were the evaluator, would look at, well, what's the outcome related to what the program's actually intended to do.
Thank you, Felix. Thank you so much. So I guess if we have one final question, or shall we say we wrap it up, and we already exceeded by 3 minutes. So I guess so. I would like to thank you all, thank our panelists and attendants today. we would like to invite everyone to answer the post-event survey that we will post right now in the chat and help us to hear back from you in order to design better events next time around. We would also like to give you a heads up regarding our subsequent panel on the results of the systematic review on tertiary preventions on December 10. We will send you an email invitation soon, and wishing you all an excellent rest of the day. I don't know if anyone has anything more to add. Brett, would you like to add anything before we close it up for the day? I guess have an excellent rest of the day. This is it. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Take great care, and please never hesitate to reach out to us.
And this is Brett saying no, just a big thank you. Okay, thanks, Brett. Okay, bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.